Good morning, everyone. My name is Evgeny Pahomov. I am director of the Institute for the Ocean and Fisheries. And first, I would like to acknowledge that majority of you here today are located in Vancouver area, and therefore are gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. First, I would like to say that this session will be recorded and will be then later uploaded to the IOF YouTube page, slightly in the later stage. During the Q&A portion of the seminar, if you ask questions live, your voice may show up, but most likely it will be just not the case. No faces will be shown otherwise. So I would like to mention that chat is for the questions only. So if you do have a question to a speaker, please enter them in the chat box located at the bottom bar of the Zoom screen towards the middle. Once we get to the Q&A session, those questions will be read out by our facilitators, Colette Bobnitz and Gabriel Rigadou. And they will direct these questions to Dr. Reid. And now I would like to, it's my pleasure to present Dr. Andrea Reid. Andrea is a citizen of the Nisga'a Nation. And in addition to being newly minted PhD, congratulations, Andrea, again. I'm not tired to say this over and over again. Dr. Andrea Reid is IOF incoming assistant professor, Indigenous Fisheries. And this role she will accept very soon in January 2021. Once here, Andrea will will help to leading the Indigenous Fisheries Research Unit, working to build a national and international hub for the study and protection of culturally significant fish and fisheries. Her research program adopts highly interdisciplinary and applied approaches to improving our understanding of the complex interrelationships between fish, people, and place. Dr. Reid's research focuses on multiple stressors effects on Pacific salmon, using tools and insights from Western and Indigenous sciences jointly or in tandem. She is a co-founder of Riparia, a Canadian charity that connects diverse young women with science on the water to grow the next generation of water protectors. Andrea is also a National Geographic explorer and grantee over several years between 2012 and 2019, and a fellow of the Explorer Club. And this is my really pleasure to warmly welcome Dr. Reid or Andrea. Please take away. That's all yours.
Thank you, Evgeny. I'm just gonna share my screen here. All right, so neat. Amwila Willina, hello, how are you? Thanks, Evgeny, for the warm wishes and very kind words. It's my absolute honor to be here for my very first presentation to the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries outside of my job interview. And I'm getting increasingly, incredibly excited to launch the new Indigenous Fisheries Research Unit at the start of next year, which is now just a few months away. So as Evgeny mentioned, I'm a citizen and member of the Nisga'a First Nation in northern BC. I'm a descendant of the Stewart family from Gingolth and of the Giskask or killer whale clan. But I'm also Kumsiwa or white, and I was raised on Prince Edward Island in Eastern Canada on Mi'kmaq territory. But I've been finding my way home through my work on fish and fisheries for now several years. And today I'm joining you from the Algonquin Anishinaabe territory in Ottawa, where I just completed my PhD, as Evgeny noted, and I look very forward to soon being a guest along with many of you on the territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So today I'll be sharing a 40 or so minute presentation on TwoEyed Seeing, an Indigenous framework to transform fisheries research and management, which is the second chapter of my PhD thesis. And I am absolutely delighted to have so many of you here with me today. I'm grateful to all of you for taking time out of your days to join. It means a lot to me to see just so much interest and enthusiasm in this topic and in the broader area of Indigenous fisheries. So toyoksanism for the enthusiasm, the encouragement. I so appreciate it, especially at this very strange time for us all. We're currently dealing with a lot with both a global pandemic and major social justice issues across this land and across these waters. And I just want to extend my thoughts and my prayers to all of those who are engaged in these very real struggles. The work that I'm here to share today would not have been possible without the groundwork laid and guidance given very graciously by Mi'kmaq elder Dr. Albert Marshall from the Eskasoni First Nation, who brought forward the concept of two-eyed seeing into the academic literature. Albert, in his extreme humility, is adamant that he's not the father, the creator, the architect of two-eyed seeing. He's a devoted carrier of the teaching, and he upholds his responsibilities to two-eyed seeing through his actions. Albert and I worked with a number of fisheries and conservation scientists from across the land, now known as Canada, to bring together a review of two-eyed seeing and its applications to fisheries, which was just accepted in the journal Fish and Fisheries. So please keep an eye out for that. And our team had the privilege in this work to collaborate with illustrator Nicole Burton, who illustrates children's books like The Boy Who Walked Backwards, about an Ojibwe boy from Serpent River who escapes residential school, as well as comics like Eugenie Shark, which is all about the life and times of shark biologist Eugenie Clark. Nicole is an activist through her art and design and engaging with many social justice issues and themes, and it's really her approach to drawing attention to serious diversity concerns and changing who we consider to be experts and scientists that originally drew me to her work. She also shares family connections to the Nass River Valley, home of the Niska Nation, so that was an obvious draw for me. So you're going to see Nicole's work interspersed throughout this seminar. So like paddling a seaworthy canoe, this was very much a collaborative effort, so it's truly my pleasure to just start us off by recognizing each and every one of those who grabbed a paddle along the way. So I'd like to kick things off by just having each of you reflect for yourselves for a moment on why you're here, what interests you in this idea of reconciling ways of knowing. We have folks that are joining from multiple universities, different levels of government and various agencies, a range of nonprofit and non-governmental organizations, a variety of First Nations and other Indigenous groups, all here for many reasons, and I'm just going to speculate on a few. So from my view, there's burgeoning interest in how we reconcile ways of knowing, in large part due to the growing national and international interest in Indigenous rights, recognition that these exist on a global scale. We have policy instruments like UNDRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is setting a baseline expectation for what Indigenous rights countries need to be upholding and recognizing. I recently heard my colleague Danica Littlechild, who's an Indigenous legal expert now based out of Carleton University, emphasize how these are very much the floor. They're not the ceiling in terms of what they do and protect. They're the starting point, not a pie in the sky target. In Canada, we also have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is focused on documenting the history and impacts of the residential school system, yes, but they lay out 94 calls to action that fundamentally center on upholding and respecting Indigenous rights here at home. The next is that Black Lives Matter and equity, diversity, and inclusion concerns are very real. We're in the midst of a social and political movement advocating against police brutality and racially motivated violence that is opening many people's eyes to the injustices faced by many Black, Indigenous, and people of color on this continent and around the world. And this is creating palpable ripple effects in the academy, with people questioning, finally, recruitment and admission policies, for example, or available trainings for staff, faculty, and students. Also drawing attention to the type of research that's done and what type of knowledge is privileged and valued. Related to this is stronger awareness that Everything from journalism to science reflects the values of the society from which it emanates. As Candace Callison from UBC put it, there's no view from nowhere. Everyone is located in social histories and social relations. And there was a great article on this subject this past summer in the Narwhal, in which Candace states, recognizing that you're coming from somewhere becomes essential to becoming aware of what kinds of questions you should be asking, what kinds of questions you think are important. Who are the experts that can help you shed light on a situation? Whose voices need to be heard more than others? And I see this, as do many, as equally pertinent to journalism as it is in science. There are certainly other ways of knowing and being that can inform how we do things in the present. They're not made invalid or rendered unhelpful by virtue of being created or carried by people who are shaped by their community or who engage in reflexivity to recognize their own social histories, their own social relations. People are also beginning to question the very idea of wilderness, beginning to recognize Indigenous peoples as long-standing and active stewards of whole ecosystems. And this was shown really well in Dana Lepofsky's excellent seminar here just a few weeks ago. And there are recent studies showing that Indigenous lands rival formerly protected areas in terms of biodiversity maintenance. And this was shown by Richard Schuster and colleagues in 2019 in Environmental Science and Policy. There could be lessons carried within these rich traditions and teachings of stewardship and management that could help us combat our current biodiversity crisis. And linked to all of these things are changing policies and expectations. Maybe you're here because your boss or your institution has given you a mandate to integrate or include or make space for multiple ways of knowing, and you don't know where to begin. Or perhaps you're simply curious to know what this is all about. Maybe you sit proudly in the Western science camp or seeing through predominantly that lens, or are so steeped in it that you disagree with it being called Western science in the first place. I've heard all the arguments for and against the use of the term Western science, and it's really not meant to suggest that our contemporary mainstream or dominant science stems only from so-called Westerners. It's to recognize that the roots of mainstream science can be traced back to the philosophies of ancient Greece and the Renaissance, and these are practices that favor reductionism and physical law, and the approaches that stem from this tradition, while excellent in so many respects, they're also vastly different from Indigenous and other systematic enterprises for understanding the world around us, which is the very definition of science. So there's clearly a lot of potential reasons to come to this table. And I thank you very much for being here and taking a moment to think for yourself why you're here with me. So my plan for the next roughly half hour is to walk you through our TwoEyed Seeing review, which is organized into 4 main parts. So we're gonna look first at the need for moving beyond the all too common discourse of knowledge dichotomies. We'll then draw parallels between different Indigenous conceptual models that promote knowledge coexistence. And this will be followed by an examination of 3 Canadian case studies that put TwoEyed Seeing into research and management practice. And from those, we'll review some of the changes required to transform fisheries for a more equitable, sustainable, and socially just future. So starting with dichotomous discourse. Thankfully, defining Indigenous knowledge is starting to shift away from a focus of utility, what it can do for Western science, and reductionism, how it can become data to fit into Western scientific analyses. But defining this term has largely been the purview of external organizations, governments, institutions, and researchers, rather than by Indigenous peoples ourselves. One of the most widely accepted definitions of Indigenous knowledge comes to us from Fikkert Burkus from the University of Manitoba, who defines it as a cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief, evolving by adaptive processes and handed down through generations by cultural transmission about the relationship of living beings, including humans, with one another and with their environment. 2 really critical additions to this definition is that this situated knowledge is not separable from the knowledge holders or keepers, nor is it divisible from the environment in which it is embedded. For many Indigenous peoples, Indigenous knowledge isn't a definable object, but rather it's a way of living or being in the world. I define it here so that we can all start from the same page, but recognize that this definition, it's never going to do justice to all that Indigenous knowledge is and does. Society under colonial influence has long perceived Indigenous knowledge as the other and in binary opposition to Western scientific knowledge, where the latter is thought of as quantitative or factual, analytical, reductionist, based on a literate tradition. The other, in comparison, is rendered qualitative, anecdotal, intuitive, holistic, and oral. But as many authors who have come before me have argued, we really need to move beyond this dichotomous discourse, this really dualistic and simplified view that leads directly to notions of knowledge inequality and an othering process that favors continued division over coexistence. There are certainly distinctions in attributes that lead to both having strengths in different contexts, which is something that I'm going to circle back to later. But there's no righteous hierarchy of knowledge systems where one systematically outperforms the other. The prevailing solution to confronting this plurality has been the project of knowledge integration or incorporation, a process that is fraught with risks and limitations. It aims to bridge multiple knowledges, to bring new information into an existing body of knowledge, and that's generally the one that wields greater power. But as I just noted, Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing are far more than simply just information to be subsumed into the mainstream of Western science, which in essence serves only to strengthen Western science for its own ends, to concentrate power in administrative centers rather than in Indigenous communities. So for these reasons, many scholars have altogether moved away from these terms, while others stand by them but are working to redefine what they mean or how they're approached. Other terms like bridging are being proposed as alternatives, and all of these options are ultimately viable ones so long as there's concomitant recognition that language choices reflect biases and they can even perpetuate colonial inequalities. So users of these terms or their alternatives need to be explicit and transparent about their intentions with their usage. My preference is for words that connotate knowledge systems coming together equally and in parallel, words like pairing or better yet, two-eyed seeing, but ultimately recognizing that it's really the actions taken that are most important rather than the words used to describe them. So what we need are pathways that promote equitable knowledge coexistence. And thankfully, there are a number of Indigenous conceptual models that answer directly to this need. The first that I'm going to share with you, I'm going to share four. The first comes from the Haudenosaunee. It's called the Gasuenta or Turo Wampum. And this is a 17th century treaty belt to record an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and Dutch settlers in Eastern New York. And it contains these two rows of purple beads, and they're surrounded by these rows of white beads that you can see here. So the purple beads are meant to represent the vessels of both the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch, so canoes and ships. And the white beads symbolize a shared river of existence. And these distinct vessels, they remain separate. They each contain their own laws, traditions, rights, and neither disrupts the integrity or the process of the other, but they travel together and they work in partnership on shared problems. Though this is a historic model of coexistence, it remains salient today and used in environmental research and management. It's applied to environmental protection and restoration programs, water quality monitoring projects, and resource co-management initiatives. The second comes from the northeast coast of Arnhem Land, Australia, where the Yolngu people have a long-standing framework that centers around the Ganma, which is a particular confluence of seawater and freshwater. The two waters represent these distinct knowledge systems that come together, they interact, but they maintain their separateness akin to isohalines in a lagoon or estuary. Rather than compromising one another or becoming a homogeneous whole, this two ways or two waters metaphor centers on the creation of a new space where two understandings and knowledges can come together equitably and work in parallel, ultimately creating greater shared understanding. It's used as a mechanism to this day to ensure that Yule Nu are represented equally in the thinking and planning of both land and sea management. In present-day New Zealand, the Waikateru, Maori for double canoe, is a contemporary metaphorical framework where two canoes are lashed together, like you see here, temporarily and for a common purpose. So each canoe here represents their own knowledge system. It recognizes that there's inherent differences on both sides, and it's based on the assertion that respective knowledges, values, and actions are not made to fit one into the other. And as with the previous cases, there's this negotiated space in between canoes where knowledge systems can interface and innovate. It's embedded within this idea called katiakatanga. I'm sure that I'm butchering its pronunciation, but this is a Maori concept for reciprocal care between people and place. And it's been applied to uphold Maori and Western scientific knowledges within marine co-management and co-governance. And then the fourth and last is Etawaptamuk, or Two-Eyed Seeing, which is defined as learning to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strengths of mainstream, dominant, or Western knowledges and ways of knowing, and learning to use both these eyes together for the benefit of all. And this is said to be a binocular framework that leads to a wider, deeper, and more generative field of view than could be achieved by either perspective working alone or in isolation. Like the previous conceptual frameworks, it shares the notion of working collaboratively across knowledge systems on common problems. And like the double canoe, it centers on this cultural conservation concept, in this case, Netagulamuk, which is centered on promoting and preserving ecological integrity for the next 7 generations. So it too creates space for common ground, it respects differences and reduces those us-them dichotomies that I introduced and breaks down this compartmentalization of knowledge that leads to domination and exclusion. What sets Two-Eyed Seeing apart, though, from these other frameworks is in its explicit action imperative. Central to Two-Eyed Seeing is this idea that knowledge transforms the holder and that the holder bears a responsibility to act on that knowledge. So Netagulamuk implores one to uphold their responsibilities to future generations. So this isn't to say that the other frameworks don't inform one's actions, but rather that Two-Eyed Seeing uniquely moves beyond unifying knowledges as the end goal to unified knowledges, and here is what we are compelled to do as the ultimate realization of the framework. So it's perhaps in part due to this assertion that Two-Eyed Seeing has extended beyond conceptual spaces, and there's a growing number of studies and management practices that put Two-Eyed Seeing into concrete practice. So the big question here isn't whether Two-Eyed Seeing or these other frameworks can help us confront challenges in a post-colonial or neo-colonial society or in the midst of our environmental crises. But in the words of Lawless and colleagues, it's rather how they might be configured and applied. A significant challenge to date is the lack of pre-existing guidelines, as the application of these frameworks depends highly on specific contexts, as well as the receptiveness of all of the actors involved. So this brings us to the case studies portion of this seminar, centering on these examples that carry out and honor Two-Eyed Seeing in practice. The first is set in the Slave River Delta in the Northwest Territories of Canada, where significant resource development activity upstream, like the oil sands operations in northern Alberta, the WAC Bennett Dam in northern BC, they're having profound impacts on ecosystem health and societal well-being downstream further north. So this is a place where hunting and fishing comprise a vital part of Indigenous life. And in direct response to growing community concern here about the health of fish specifically, a variety of actors in this region, including 3 First Nations, 3 Métis organizations, 2 towns, a college, a research institute, and territorial and federal agencies, they've come together to create this partnership, the Slave River and Delta Partnership in 2010. And their main goal was to create community-based monitoring programs throughout the region. And for this, they solicited assistance from various academic partners, And together they co-hosted a workshop in 2011. And they developed 3 main lines of inquiry that the monitoring efforts were meant to answer. So first, is the water still safe to drink? Are the fish and wildlife still safe to eat? Is the ecosystem still healthy? And this paper, led by Crystal Mantica-Pringle and colleagues, published in 2017 in Environment International, this offers responses to these key questions. So at this workshop, participants identified indicators of aquatic ecosystem health through both an Indigenous knowledge and a Western scientific lens. So where water quality and fish health could be described in terms of turbidity and NTUs, or fish external anomalies, as in the number of cysts or tumors or lesions or malformations through a Western scientific lens. They could likewise be understood in terms of the physical appearance of water, changes in water visibility or movement over time, or fish aesthetics, the quality of fish flesh over time. And so that's through an Indigenous knowledge lens. Through the Western science lens, there were 19 indicators that were informed through field observations and document reviews, while key informant interviews informed the basis of 22 different indicators of Indigenous knowledge indicators used in this system. So then they used participatory modeling. Each of these 41 indicators in total were brought together in a Bayesian belief network to inform those 3 central questions, so they could explore all of those different interactions. And I'm going to skip over the laborious methods to just tell you the main take-home messages. They determined that there was a low probability that the social ecological system is as healthy as it once was. And they found that where multiple Western science indicators were generally graded as moderate in comparison with the past, Indigenous knowledge indicators were more consistently graded as low, which is really interesting to think about conceptually, that for many of these indicators, Western science sets a certain threshold before it'll consider water unsafe to drink or fish unsafe to eat. There's an underlying assumption that some low level of contamination is going to have negligible effects, which could be true in certain cases. But on the flip side, on the Indigenous knowledge side, in many cases, this centers on the opposite premise, where any perceptible change from a past known state is being noted. So there's this greater potential sensitivity to perturbation or disturbance. And a really neat aspect of this tool of Bayesian belief networks, and I know there's many people on this call that already use this tool and know that it's a great way to reconcile ways of knowing, it's that it's a living product and it can be readily updated as new knowledge becomes available, making it an asset for understanding aquatic ecosystem change through a holistic lens moving forward. The next case study that we examined centers on the Saskatchewan River Delta, North America's largest freshwater delta at 10,000 square kilometers. And it shares a really similar context with the example above, where upstream anthropogenic activities, primarily the E.B. Campbell, Gardner, and Nipawin dams, have profoundly reshaped system hydrology, as well as fish and wildlife populations, provoking both community concern and the 2012 formation of a collaborative community academic partnership in response. Academic partners from the University of Saskatchewan identified 3 main questions that center on bigger questions around epistemology and methodology. So first, how can we learn about long-term social ecological change from diverse knowledge holders? How can we provide for the coexistence of plural forms of knowledge while engaging in respectful critique? And third, how can we document the relative contribution each knowledge system provides and explain how each helps to fill in the gaps of the other? And to this, Abu and colleagues have published this paper in the International Journal of Water Resources Development in 2019 in response. So through literature review, the authors of that study outline a bunch of different approaches for bridging knowledge systems, much like I've done on the front end of this talk. And they identify TwoEyed Seeing as the guiding framework that's going to enable them to address their main questions. So this article draws on 3 different sources of main evidence for ecosystem change in the Delta. The first line of evidence was Indigenous knowledge drawn from key informant interviews. The second was archival records from the province of Saskatchewan on everything from historic data to past policies to letters and petitions. And the third was field-based data on water quality, fish harvest, and the like. Again, these were quantitative and qualitative information brought together through a really simple but elegant means of examining knowledge congruence, where knowledge systems were indexed as either consistent, they were in agreement, showing trends in the same direction, they were inconsistent in disagreement, or there's an evidence type lacking for that comparison. And so they did this for 37 different indicators of change in hydrology, fish and wildlife, and vegetation, and produced these kinds of tables where you can see that there's plus signs, and those show where there's agreement. Negative signs show disagreement, and the ought symbols show where there's one or the other evidence type lacking. And what they found was a huge degree of convergence across knowledge systems, where adverse changes in hydrology, fish and wildlife, and vegetation were reflected across most since the development of upstream dams. But there were, again, some incongruent indicators. As a couple examples, Indigenous knowledge, again, here signaled that there's current poor water quality, whereas instrumental observations declared it safe. It also noted that there's a high abundance of northern pike, whereas field data was suggesting that they were closer to zero or definitely lower. But this could be explained by reducing commercial interest in northern pike, and the data set that was being used was based on fish landing data. So that just might be one reason why these two disconnect. Another really fascinating finding within this is that for the 9 indicators of vegetation, Western science was lacking in 6 of those cases, showing the extreme utility of Indigenous knowledge in these systems. So for the third and final case study, we shift to Unama'ki, or Cape Breton Island, which is home to the largest Indigenous community in Atlantic Canada and the largest Mi'kmaq community on the continent, the Eskasoni First Nation, from which Albert hails. The Eskasoni community is deeply engaged in fishing activities for food, social, and ceremonial purposes, as well as commercially, with a community-owned and operated fishing company that employs over 150 fishers and contributes to nearly 10% of Eskasoni's annual revenues. Since 1999, Eskasoni has been home to the Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources, UINR, which was formed in response to rising community concerns regarding natural resources, particularly fisheries, and their sustainability. One of their main goals is to strengthen research and natural resource management while maintaining Mi'kmaq knowledges and worldviews. So to this end, they frequently partner with external governments, with organizations, universities on key environmental questions, using TwoEyed Seeing as the mechanism to maintain knowledge equality. One such partnership, Giles et al. 2016, involved researchers from Dalhousie and UINR, as well as commercial fishers and representatives from the Eskasoni First Nation. And together, they examined Indigenous inclusion in policy-level fisheries decision-making in Canada, using Eskasoni's American eel fishery as a model system. So through interviews with these distinct groups, they examined the inclusion of Mi'kmaq knowledge in eel management and decision-making, highlighting specific areas where inclusion is sorely lacking, but could easily be made more possible. And based on Mi'kmaq eeling practices, they outline very specific management recommendations to be used alongside the mainstream Fisheries and Oceans Canada dominated approach to management decisions, so that decisions here reflect both Indigenous and Western values together at the same time. So while the authors here identify a lot of barriers to TwoEyed Seeing really transforming their fishery, they talk about various logistical challenges where there's no formal process for knowledge integration or pairing. There's also concerns around data ownership, which can be a huge challenge in these contexts. There are also conceptual disconnects. There's no space in this process for, say, cultural or spiritual components, and the two systems operate on such different timescales. One is incredibly immediate, and the other is looking 7 generations down the line. They also cite various communication breakdowns, where these groups are using different languages, they have different interpretations, and there's also significant historical traumas and issues of mistrust between the Mi'kmaq and the Canadian government. But nevertheless, even after reviewing all of this, they still cite considerable opportunity for bringing Mi'kmaq knowledge systems to bear on current eel management practices, and they present a really clear way forward made possible by TwoEyed Seeing. But their main conclusion, it remains that the full understanding of Mi'kmaq knowledge is not reflected in the dominant approach to management, making it clear that for TwoEyed Seeing to really work in these contexts, it really requires parties on all sides of the equation to come together and be willing partners. It makes apparent that this is continued colonial sentiment is preventing their full and equitable inclusion in fisheries policy and decision making. And this is very much what we're currently seeing on the East Coast, with tensions super high around the creation of a community-run commercial licensing system to enable Indigenous participation in the highly lucrative lobster fishery. We're living at a time where rights recognition is indeed growing, as I stated at the beginning, but there's a lot of work to be done so that asserting these rights isn't seen by some as illegal action. It ultimately comes back to this question of creating pathways. Sebaganagati fishers have repeatedly stated that they've waited 20 years for the Canadian government to create moderate livelihood licenses following the 1999 Supreme Court of Canada Marshall decision that guaranteed a moderate livelihood for Mi'kmaq and Maliseet fishers, but no pathway for this was ever put in place in this time frame. So they needed to make it happen for themselves, developing their own management plan and granting fewer than 10 Indigenous licenses compared against the approximately 980 non-Indigenous licenses in this one specific area. So how do we change this status quo in our fisheries systems? How can we rethink fisheries to allow space for multiple ways of knowing and being? The inclusion of Indigenous knowledge systems in fisheries research and management has been shown to offer technological shifts that improve fisheries selectivity and sustainability, to enhance early warning systems for sea state forecasting, to reverse declines in the abundance and size of exploited species, to yield otherwise inaccessible ecological insights like missing baseline data, as well as to play a critical role in the improvement as well as the collective adherence to fisheries policy. But it's extremely rare that the past and present impacts of colonialism on these knowledge systems and their power is recognized, let alone rectified, which is said to be both practically and politically dangerous. Since colonization, conventional fisheries management has relied on a singular approach and understanding based on Western science. In recent decades, there have been shifts towards integration or incorporation, which have often been used as euphemisms for the assimilation of Indigenous knowledge into Western science. And this hasn't done much to transform how fisheries are understood or managed. What TwoEyed Seeing moves us towards is a framework whereby knowledge systems can work in parallel on shared problems, where time-tested Indigenous knowledge systems can be paired with, not subsumed by Western scientific insights and advances. As many here today know well, our fisheries are in trouble. They're failing in many parts of the world. The conventional fisheries paradigm was developed primarily in the service of single stock, large scale and commodity oriented fisheries in north temperate parts of the world. And this approach has adhered to what some have termed the illusion of certainty that nature is controllable and knowable. And it's been incredibly hierarchical and paternalistic, ascribing to command and control resource management practices. There have been calls from within this group to reinvent fisheries management, and there have been strong pushes towards ecosystem-based approaches, but these have yet to overcome the substantial inertia of current practices and prevailing paradigms. Given that fisheries are hugely complex social ecological systems, there's no single comprehensive or correct perspective, but they're perhaps best understood in a plurality of ways involving all of those who are involved in the fishery, particularly at this time of climate uncertainty, highly variable fisheries catches, incomplete data in many of the world's fisheries. We need to do better and together. And there are significant potential costs associated with not doing so. So not only would it behoove fisheries scientists to use all and the best tools available at this time of crisis, irrespective of their origin, this would importantly serve decolonial and reconciliatory efforts, helping to rectify some of those uneven power relations, knowledge inequalities, and other racially linked injustices that I previously discussed. So what have we learned from our case studies that can inform how we move forward and together? All of the studies that we looked at were set in motion by communitism, where Indigenous communities identified the original needs and they invited in external partners in accordingly. They established a mutual research interest and identified what tools were needed and best suited for the given problem together. Most approaches were hugely participatory. They were co-developed, co-run, and co-evaluated by the collaborative teams all conducting the research. The benefits were mutual, and this wasn't something that I highlighted as I went through them, but that was reflected in paper co-authorship. And all of these relationships are positioned for operation in the long term, with each study really creating a unique current or future pathway for TwoEyed Seeing in their context. They really demonstrate the context-dependent nature of this framework, that solutions aren't going to be one size fits all. In fact, knowledge pairing or working in parallel was generally achieved through a multiplicity of different mechanisms that were matched to their own individual circumstances. All of these studies respected that multiple realities exist in a fisheries or aquatic system. They considered multiple knowledges as equal and valid. They embraced what's called relational accountability by promoting respectful representation and reciprocity in their research. And they were highly participatory and place-based. And to me, these are key ingredients for research and management moving forward. Rounding out our understanding and approach to fisheries to include other knowledges and ways of knowing is no longer an issue of awareness or methods. As we've shown here, we know how to do it, but the barriers are instead around time to build those requisite relationships. There's a general lack of incentives. There's little provocation away from inaction. And there's deeply entrenched systems of political power or an unsubstantiated perception of knowledge hierarchies. So recognizing that knowledge is not free from social process and that scientific interpretations are socially motivated and constructed to a large extent. These, in my view, are the first steps that are going to help us move away from that status quo approach. TwoEyed Seeing isn't a simple formula of getting a certain number of people in a room or taking an equal amount of insights and tools from various schools of thought. It's meant to be a reflexive practice that's used throughout the research or management process to guide our priorities, our decisions, our choices. And since I've come to know it, since I've had this privilege, it's something that I've carried with me through my approaches in my doctoral research, where I've paired traditional and contemporary tools and insights into better understanding major threats and solutions to migrating sockeye salmon. I also carry this in my outreach and my teaching activities that I lead through science camps in my nation, as well as the charity that I co-run that Evgeny mentioned, Riperia, which centers on connecting diverse young women with all kinds of science on the water through multi-day paddling trips. And it's something that I will carry with me throughout much, if not all of my activities here in the IOF. So I look forward to getting that going. So if TwoEyed Seeing is something that you'd like to learn more about or to hear about from a range of perspectives, including Albert Marshall himself, I welcome you all to join on October 28th to the Reconciling Ways of Knowing Forum that's co-hosted by David Suzuki, Miles Richardson, Nancy Turner, and Dave Courchain. And that's also going to involve myself, Jessie Popp, who is Chair of Indigenous Environmental Science at the University of Guelph, as well as Deb McGregor, Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice at the Osgoode Hall Law School at York University. So you can visit waysofknowingforum.ca and watch for social media posts with information pertaining to this event. So with that, I would like to say Toyoxanism, thank you again to each of you, and I look forward to questions and comments, and please don't hesitate to be in touch.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for a really fantastic presentation and a very thought-provoking and timely one, and beautifully illustrated at that. Personally, I really like the fact that you drew case studies to our attention and then drew out at the end some important lessons learned or key ingredients, as you call them. So as we said at the beginning of the talk, we're going to read out the questions to you. And Gabrielle and I will relay each other in that role. So the first question is from Sarah Cannon. And the question is, how can UNDRIP help to protect the rights of Indigenous nations in practice? It was formalized as part of BC law, but we still see regular violation of these rights. For example, in the case of the Wet'suwet'en and the Sekopem people, which seem on the surface at least to be in clear violation of UNDRIP.
Absolutely. This is a huge question that we now face, and I think UNDRIP is a tool that we can begin to leverage and try to hold nations accountable, but it's something that we really need everyone to be a part of this conversation in order for it to carry meaning. It's increasingly changing, you know, the policies that we have in place within our institutions, with UBC adopting UNDRIP, and hopefully that means actual changes on the ground, but it really requires all Canadians to hold the government accountable. I think it's a huge question, a huge area of research, and I will be watching and actively involved as things kind of move ahead. But I don't have a clear answer on that. I don't think anybody does. It's a major issue that we face today.
Hello, Andrea. Thank you for your great talk. There is a question from Anna Maria. The question is, how do you separate Western science data from Western political decisions that may manipulate or ignore the Western science data?
That is a great question as well. I mean, it depends on who is doing the work and the specific context that we're talking about. When I'm talking about Western scientific data throughout this, there are definitely blockages that exist to that data seeing the light of day in certain cases. So we need to be really transparent about who's involved in research, and transparent when there are external influences that are imposing constraints on what information is coming to the table. But I think that that's something that really varies by context. If you want to add more, I'm happy to speculate further.
Thank you, Andrea. The next question is from Cora, and she specifically asked, do you have any advice for students who are trying to push university science departments to teach Indigenous ways of knowing alongside Western ways of knowing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And something that I've really struggled with through my work and experience is that so much of this just comes from the organic finding of these things because I needed these tools for myself. I was not taught them in a formal setting, and that is a really pervasive problem for a lot of these topics and concerns. Most times when I give a lecture, I feel like that's a very common comment that I receive, that we didn't learn any of this in school. We don't have the tools, the terminology, all of that kind of thing. In terms of putting pressure, I mean, it really is, we need to see the creation of more positions like the one that I am very grateful to be coming into, to have Indigenous people in leadership positions at institutions so they can be at the forefront of leading that kind of thing. For me, I'm really looking forward to developing courses centered on Indigenous knowledge at UBC at both the undergrad and graduate level. as a graduate student myself, I've been involved with our Indigenous Strategic Initiative at Carleton University, which has specific calls to action for exactly those things. So just learning how you can be an ally and a support to groups like that, or getting involved directly, is a really good place to start on university campuses.
Another question from Leanne. How might we apply the TwoEyed Seeing to other disciplines in science, particularly in areas that have not been considered traditional indigenous knowledge, so computer science, cell or molecular biology?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, well, TwoEyed Seeing, I mean, it really has had the most traction, where it really has taken off in the scientific literatures in the realm of medicine. And that's a place that it still has a lot of room to grow, to be sure. But there are a lot of groups that are working really hard on how we bring together Indigenous healing traditions alongside mainstream dominant ones. So there's some really good papers that I could point to in that space. Outside of those sciences, in the more physical sciences, or in chemistry, or whatever the field might be, I think it really varies by topic, and I'm less familiar with how it would build into those other areas. But I know that there are there's some consideration to this in terms of astronomy. I think that there are some related papers on this subject, and how we bring together cosmology into this way of thinking. But big picture, I think that the tools are the same regardless of the discipline. It's more just how it aligns for me, because I spend a lot of time thinking about these ecological knowledge systems. That's where I've placed most of my effort.
Thank you. I was just going to quickly say also, just in case we don't get through all questions, no worries, we'll send them to you so that you get a chance to answer them individually if you wish. So the next question is from Quinn Anderson. And the question is, what role do marine or ocean conservation organizations play in supporting Indigenous rights as they seek to achieve conservation goals? How can they seek to better include these perspectives and ways of knowing in conservation work?
That's a great question. There are so many, there are roles for everyone in this conversation. The assertion and protection of Indigenous rights is a shared responsibility for people in this country, and it doesn't sit only on the laps of Indigenous peoples to act on those and to uphold them. There are some really good toolkits out there. The Indigenous Ally Toolkit is a really wonderful tool. I can provide a link in the chat after, but there are some thoughtful ways that organizations can show their allyship, but also just in terms of organizational practices to make sure that they adhere within the frameworks that are laid out by UNDRIP. That's a really important starting point, just ensuring that your main activities don't infringe on those basic rights. And I really love Danica Littlechild's point about they're just the starting point for these conversations. They're not kind of the end goal here.
And a question from Megan Sharp. Through the 3 case study, you've pointed a picture on how Indigenous knowledge can be used in parallel with Western science on projects that aim to outline management plans. I'm wondering how TwoEyed Seeing can be used in more theoretical or process-based scientific questions.
Yeah, well, TwoEyed Seeing, I mean, it has the potential to inform everything from the way that we formulate questions. Here I really focused on the methodological aspect, because I find that that's often where I get the most questions, that people understand the need for reconciling ways of knowing, and they want to go about doing this kind of work, but don't know how to actually get to the business of making things work in parallel. So that's where I've focused my efforts. But certainly TwoEyed Seeing has a role from just the very questions that we bother to ask to the methodologies that we go about employing as we try to answer them. There's some really great writing and thinking on TwoEyed Seeing from Cape Breton University on their integrative science webpage. If you search that, there's workshops, there's tools, there's specific guidance that come directly from Albert Marshall and his team, and that can provide further insight. And a really neat aspect of this work is that while my focus has been really fisheries centered and ecologically focused, Albert's engaged on a huge range of subjects, and you'll see on the integrative science webpage, the list of different disciplines that he's engaged with is very vast. It includes random things from mining to dentistry. So I encourage you to go have a look.
And the last question we'll take now is from Carlina Lord, before Evgeny wraps things up for us. So the question is specifically for areas where there isn't a baseline perspective, or in instances where Indigenous knowledge is not available, what is your recommendation on developing that qualitative observation, as it is not recognized as either Western science or Indigenous knowledge?
So just a clarification, I don't know if you can provide a follow-up in the chat to Colette. But so this is you mean in a space where there isn't an Indigenous history in that specific region, or there's not Indigenous knowledge on a given subject?
I'll keep you posted.
Okay, apologies. I just want that clarification, but
both. Carlina says both.
Okay. Well, I mean, so much of this, I mean, I've really centered this on Indigenous knowledge systems and that way of thinking because it's dear to my heart, and I think that it has a lot to offer in these spaces. But the same premises can hold true for many other ways of knowing, whether it's local knowledge holders or other community members. This is just really a way for enabling parallel modes of thinking and for promoting equality in these spaces. In areas where there is no longer Indigenous presence, or where perhaps there never was, it depends on what the end goal is. I mean, something I really wanted to highlight through the case studies is that all of these cases, they were brought about by community needs and desires. And I think that for so long, research has been dominated by scientists parachuting into places and kind of asserting what needs to be done and what needs to be known. And we really need to reverse that narrative. In cases where there isn't Indigenous knowledge on a given subject, I think that we can only work with what we have, and there are going to be many times when we have Indigenous knowledge and no Western science, or the reverse of that. And so that's kind of the strength of bringing together all of the tools. It's of recognizing that we can learn from all ways of knowing, that they're all equally valid and important, and so just bringing together everything will enable us to have the best answer we can on the best available evidence.
Thank you, Andrea, and what a treat. I would like to thank you for the presentation on behalf of myself and the UBC Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries.